Hi, today I'll talk about the critical thinking in forecasting and how a system CFO, how does a system CFO see the whole picture? I once reviewed a forecast and that was technically perfect. The analyst had used all of the right techniques, by the way. Linear regression for stable line items. He used the exponential models for those high growth areas. He kind of like calibrated the seasonal adjustments and applied them correctly. They were very well done. There were elegant formulas, nice spreadsheets, and yet the forecast was wrong. The forecast was still wrong. Significantly wrong, actually. Why? Because it assumed that the world would stay the same. It did not account for the fact that our largest customer was being acquired. It didn't consider that a new competitor was launching next quarter. It did not reflect that we were about to change our pricing model. It did not reflect the fact that the behavior of the market was changing significantly because of the introduction of new technologies. The math was right. The thinking, the common sense was wrong. So here's what I've learned over the 25 years that I've been a CFO. Forecasting is not all about math. It's about judgment. It's about intuition. The techniques, linear, non-linear, seasonal, they are simply tools. What matters is how you think about the future, how you assimilate the future into your thinking. And a system CFO does not just build forecasts, they interrogate them. They understand the assumptions, they see the connections. They know when to trust a model and when to override it. So today, I want to talk about how to think critically about forecasting. And it's not about statistical techniques and mathematical techniques. We have covered those in 3 videos in the past. It's a mindset. It's a mindset. And to begin with, we have to understand what the limits of forecasting are. Forecasting, by definition, is inherently uncertain. Otherwise, we'll all be millionaires if we are right. No matter how sophisticated your model, you cannot predict the future with certainty. There's this thing called randomness. I say this not to discourage you, but to set the right expectations. The goal of forecasting is not necessarily to be exactly right. It is to be useful. It is to be less wrong than you would be without a forecast. It is to understand the range of possibilities and prepare for them. A weather forecast that says 70% chance of rain is useful even though it's not certain. You still carry an umbrella, don't you? You adjust your plans, you're prepared. On the other hand, business forecast is also working the same way. A good forecast will tell you what is likely, what is possible, and what would have to change for different outcomes to occur. And that is valuable insight, and that is valuable even though it's not a guarantee. So now there are 3 types of uncertainty that I need you to understand. There is one which is a model uncertainty. Did you choose the right technique? Is the relationship really linear or is it exponential? Is there seasonality you missed? It's a very academic type of discussion at this point. This is uncertainty about whether your model structure is correct. Next is the parameter uncertainty, right? Even if the model structure is right, you have chosen the right model, the specific numbers might be wrong. You estimated 10% growth rate, but it could be 8 or 12. And this is uncertainty about the inputs into your model. Then there is a structural uncertainty, and this is really the big one, by the way. It is the uncertainty of whether the underlying system will change. Maybe growth has been 10% for 5 years, but a new competitor is about to disrupt the market, and your growth is going to basically can down to 1% or 0%. And your model cannot artificially see that coming, right? I mean, independently, it cannot see that coming. A critical thinker is the one that acknowledges all these 3 types of uncertainty. They don't present forecast as facts. They communicate ranges, they communicate scenarios, and they interrogate the key assumptions. They are truly honest about what they don't know. So choosing the right approach is very important. In the last several videos, I covered linear forecasting, I covered non-linear forecasting, I covered seasonal forecasting. And the critical question is, how do you know which one to use? So let me give you a basic framework. Look at your data, and before you pick a technique, understand what the data is telling you. Plot it. Is it a straight line or curve? Does it fluctuate in a regular pattern? And sometimes the right approach is obvious just from looking at the chart. Calculate the growth rates. Are they constant in dollars, suggesting linear, or constant in percentages, suggesting exponential? And these simple checkpoints are important to keep you in the right direction, to put you in track in the right direction. Look for seasonal rhythms. Do the same months they repeat every year? If yes, you need that seasonal adjustment, right? We talked about that. Understand the drivers. Don't just look at the outcomes, understand what is causing it. If revenue is being driven by headcount and you're adding people at a steady rate, then of course linear models might be appropriate. If revenue is compounding because customers expand over time, non-linear would make a lot of sense. And if revenue is, let's say, tied to certain events that happen at certain times of the year, then seasonality matters. So, it's a mix of all of these three components that can come into play. The driver logic often matters more than the statistical fit. A model that fits the data but contradicts the business logic is likely wrong. So consider the time horizon as well. Different techniques, they work better for different time horizons. Linear is safest. Why? Because of the short-term forecasts. You're looking at 1 or 2 quarters. Non-linear becomes important for longer time horizons where compounding effects accumulate. Seasonality matters whenever your horizon spans multiple seasons. If you're forecasting next month, keep it simple. If you're forecasting 3 years out, you need to think about curves and cycles. Step 4, test multiple approaches. When you're uncertain, don't just pick one model. Build several and compare them. What does linear say? What does exponential say? What does seasonal adjustment mean? What does it show? And if they all kind of point in the same direction, you have a little bit more confidence in numbers. If they are diverging, all of them are diverging, you need to understand why and make a judgment call. Now, step number 5 is very important because you're now validating against history. You take your model, you apply it to historical data. Would it predict accurately? If your model cannot explain the past, it probably won't be able to predict the future. It's called nested hypothesis testing. It's also called back testing in other areas. It's a sanity check, and that catches models that look good on paper but don't actually work. So these are the various lenses that a systems CFO ought to look at these various tools that claim to know or make a claim to understand the future, right? So a systems thinking approach is one that brings it all together, but there's one critical question. One very critical question that a systems CFO needs to ask. What are the assumptions I'm making? Because every forecast has assumptions. Some of them are explicit, some of them are hidden. But what are they? Am I assuming that the market stays the same? Or the market size stays the same? Am I assuming that the competitors don't change their behavior? Am I assuming our pricing will remain the same as well? Am I assuming we can hire the people we need? You list the assumptions and then you ask the question, what happens if each one is wrong? Question 2, what would have to be true for this forecast to be right? And so what happens is this flips a perspective. Instead of asking if the forecast is reasonable, ask what conditions would make it happen. If the forecast is showing 30% growth, what has to go right? Do we need to launch a new product on time? Do we need to close 3 enterprise deals? Do we need retention to improve? When you list the requirements, you can assess how realistic these are. The other question that often come to my mind is, what are the leading indicators, right? Because we talk about lagging indicators a lot, but leading indicators is important. Forecasts are all about the future, but leading indicators are the indicators that help you see if you're on track before results come in. So if you're forecasting revenue, what leads to revenue? Pipeline. If you're forecasting retention, what leads to retention? Product usage. If you're forecasting, let's say, costs, what is leading to costs? Hiring plans. You see where I'm going with this? Building these leading indicators into your forecasting process is a very, very critical step for a systems level thinking. They give you those early warnings when reality is diverging from the forecast. And how does this forecast, how does all of this connect to the rest of the system? This is the systems thinking question. A revenue forecast is not isolated, it connects to everything else. Revenue drives cash flow. Cash flow affects how much you can invest. Investment affects future growth. And growth affects hiring. Hiring affects capacity, and capacity affects what you can deliver. So you see, it's a full cycle, it's a virtuous cycle. So when you change one forecast, trace through the implications all the way through the end. What else needs to change? You also have to ask yourself the question number 5, who has the information that I don't have? Finance is building the forecast, but we don't have all the information. Sales is at the field level, they know which deals are real and which are wishful thinking. Marketing knows which campaigns are working. Customer success at the field level knows which accounts are at risk. Product knows what is launching and when. So you know what a good forecasting process is? It incorporates inputs from across your organization. The CFO who builds forecasts in isolation behind a computer in a corner of a room, they are flying blind. Question number 6, what could disrupt this completely? That's the first thing that always has to cross one's mind. This is the question that can catch structural changes. Is there a recession coming? Is there a new competitor offering coming or entering? Is there a regulatory change that will hit our industry? Is there a major customer at risk? Is there a technology shift? Do you see what's going on? You're asking those questions which are macro level that will have a big impact. And at that point, the forecasting doesn't matter as much as what the macro impact is going to have on your financials. I keep a list of potential disruptions and review it whenever I update forecast. Why? Because most might not happen, but the ones that do, they matter enormously. We call it the black swan events. Building scenarios, never do point forecast, because point forecast is arrogance. Range forecast is humility. A point forecast will say, we will do $10 million next year. Oh, well, great. How can you be so sure? A scenario-based approach is saying our base case is $10 million, so upside is 11.5 if the enterprise deals close, our downside is 8.5 if the churn increases. Why is this better? First is more honest and is humble. The future is uncertain. A single number, it implies false precision. Scenarios acknowledge the range of possibilities. Second, it's more useful, by the way, because if I tell the board we'll do exactly $10 million, they'll be disappointed if we do 9.5 and unimpressed if we do $10.5 million. On the other hand, if I tell them we'll do anywhere from $9 to $11 million, they can plan for that range. Third, it enables better decisions. When you have scenarios, you can ask, what would we do differently if the downside case happens? What opportunities would we pursue in the upside case? What do scenarios do? They drive contingency planning. Fourth, it identifies the key variables. What is the difference between the upside and the downside cases? Usually it's a few key factors, right? Maybe 3 big deals. Maybe a product launch. Maybe retention rates. Maybe scenarios highlight what matters most. So how do you build good scenarios? Start with a base case scenario. This is your most likely outcome given current trends and constitutes the known information. Build it carefully using the techniques that we have discussed. And then you build the upside case. What happens if things go better than expected? Don't just add some arbitrary growth number or 10% or something of that sort. Be a little bit more scientific about it. Think about what would specifically drive outperformance. Maybe certain deals need to close, maybe a new product exceeds expectations. Build the upside using real possibilities. In the same way, you also build a downside case, right? What happens if things go worse? Again, be very specific. Maybe a key customer goes away. Maybe the market softens. Maybe a product launch is delayed. Build a downside from real risks, just like we did the upside from real possibilities as well. And stress test those extreme cases, right? What is the worst that could possibly happen? This isn't likely, but it's useful for risk management. Could you survive this scenario? What would you do? When you start presenting forecasts and presenting these scenarios, you become more credible in the eyes internally and externally. If you start explaining what drives each one of these different elements, what would have to happen to end up in each case, then the system CFO is truly communicating about the future. So how do you integrate all of these different possibilities that are emerging into one holistic way of thinking? The linear, the non-linear, the seasonal thing into a coherent forecast model. So it's simple. You start with a real growth trajectory. What is the long-term direction of the business? Is it linear growth, exponential growth, S-curve? Remember we talked about that? S-curve approaching the ceiling. And this is your big picture view. For a mature, stable business, it might be linear. Yeah, you're adding roughly the same amount each year. And for a high growth startup, it might be exponential. It could be growing at a consistent percentage, and for a market leader approaching a saturation point, it might be an S-curve. And it's going to start to flatten. So now you have to think what to do next. Step number 2 is to apply the seasonality you distribute across the periods. And once you have the annual trajectory and you distribute seasonality across months or quarters using your seasonal indices, you have a better read of the patterns, the rhythm of the business. You're not necessarily changing the total for the end of the year, but you're recognizing that it won't be, the revenue might not be arriving evenly. Some months will be higher, some lower, following the pattern that you observed historically. In other words, you're not fooling yourself. Step number 3 is layering the specific known events. Now add things you know about that are not in the historical pattern. A new product that is launching in Q2, what will happen? Or a price increase taking effect in March, or a large customer renewal in September, a sales team expansion in Q3, what will happen? All these events might shift the forecast beyond what the historical patterns or your models are telling you. Layer them in explicitly. I always favor driver-based detail where it matters. For the most important line items, don't just forecast the total, build it up from drivers. Revenue might come from new customers, okay? So you look at the average deal size, you look at the expansion from existing customers, you take out the churn, but you forecast each driver separately and then combine them, and then you get a read of where things are heading, and you have a better understanding. More insight makes your assumption much more explicit and your forecasting much more tenable in the long run. Create scenarios around key uncertainties. It's totally okay. Identify the 2 or 3 factors with the biggest impact and the most uncertainty and build scenarios around them. You are being a responsible system CFO at this point. And if you're unsure whether the enterprise deals will close, build one scenario where they do and then one where it won't. And if you're unsure about the new product launch timing, build the scenarios for on time and delayed. And always check your intuition, common sense, check against reality. Step back and look at the forecast as a whole. Does it make sense? Come back to it a day later, the fresh mind. If your forecast is showing 50% growth and reality is going a different direction, then you have to question yourself. Is the forecast model tenable? Is it right? Have I missed something explicit or implicit in the assumptions that is basically giving us a direction that is very different than what I think will happen? And communicating the forecast effectively is important because you're creating that feedback loop. If you're able to communicate the forecast effectively, you're also opening the aperture large enough and broad enough to be able to invite those feedback from the various organizations getting impacted to give you a perspective that you can iterate back into your forecasting process. It's a teamwork. Forecasting is not about finance. It is about the team coming together to understand the business better and to be able to take actions. So I hope that you found this session helpful. This is where I got it all together. But most important, when you're doing the forecasting, is use your common sense. Common sense takes you a long way. Have a sense of intuition. Read a lot, read about your industry, read about white papers, or read white papers. Look at, attend webinars, look at products, and talk to the leadership and the field operations people. Because the amount of data that you get from the field and from the seminars and from the industry association research reports will inform you of the type of models that you might want to choose or not choose when you're doing your forecasting. So I hope this is helpful, and I will see you in the next session. Take care. Bye-bye.